class at 1. So, as most of you know, I'm Miriam Kine, President of Women Public Policy, and today we are having a lecture by Dr. Nigel Ashford, who is the Senior Program Officer at the Institute for Humane Studies in Washington, D.C. He comes from the UK, which you'll be able to tell from his accent, where he was a professor at, and I'm going to mess this up, Staffordshire University? Staffordshire University, okay.
No.
Well, he's
when you come to the Swedish Foundation, just say the Swedish Foundation.
Oh, I actually took that one out. Just you can tell us that now.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So he's held a variety of positions in a variety of organizations, of which he will be able to tell you the various names of. He was also the chairman of the American Political Group of the United Kingdom, and he has lectured in 16 countries and is the author of and co-author of a variety of publications, which I'm sure he'll be able to talk about if you have any questions. Dr. Ashford works on many of IHS's educational programs, which I think he's going to talk about. Teaches at summer seminars, liaisons with IHS Faculty Network. Produces regular academic newsletters for faculty and graduate students, and provides academic career advice to graduate students, which is conveniently not us. So he is here today to speak on changing the world, ideas versus interest. He's also a wealth of knowledge about the think tank world in Washington, D.C. I'm sure if you have any questions, he'd be willing to talk to you afterwards. Also, and he'll be able to tell you more about this program as well, but Jody asked me to remind you all, A, to check your boxes, because most of you don't, I know. And B, there's the COKE program that has a variety of summer and year-long fellowships in D.C. Again, Dr. Ashford will be able to speak a little bit more on that, but do check your boxes because I think this just went in yesterday. So, anyway, without further ado,
Thanks very much for the invitation. The fact that you are on a Masters in Public Policy program, I presume that's what you all are, that would imply to me that you're not entirely happy with the state of public policy today, that there are some things you would like to change. So that obviously raises two questions. The first question is, how does policy get changed? And the second question it raises, what can you do to contribute to the changes that you want to convey? So what I want to do is I want to look at three different schools of thought about how the world gets changed. And one thing perhaps I should be upfront and clear about, my organisation is a classical liberal / libertarian organisation. So I'm going to look at it from the point of view of how do we change the world in favour of greater liberty. That might not be your priority. You may be interested in changing the world in a different way, but the questions I want to raise, I think, are the same, however you want to change the world, in whatever direction you want to take it. But you should be clear that this is where I'm coming from, is from a particular perspective, and the sorts of people that I'm going to draw upon. So what I want to do is to present these three different views about how the world gets changed. Then I want to throw it up to you and say, how do you think the world gets changed? And one way of doing that is responding to the three schools of thought that I'm going to present. And another way of doing it is to say that if I gave you $10 million a year, and I want to be absolutely clear, I'm not going to give you $10 million a year, but if I gave you $10 million a year, what would be the most effective way of changing the world in the direction that you want to go? That's one way of answering the question. You don't have to answer that. And at the end, I'll just spend a little bit about the opportunities that we have with my organisation, Institute for Humane Studies. We have scholarships, we have internships, we have seminars, we have websites, and I thought I'd be very happy to talk about the COKE Associate Programme and the other programmes because it's slightly confusing. We run a programme called the COKE Summer Fellowship, which is a summer programme, and the COKE Foundation runs something called the COKE Associate Programme, which is a year-long programme, and a COKE Internship Programme, which is a semester-length programme. So people get very confused about what. So I'd be happy to explain what the differences are and which one might be most appropriate for you. So let me begin with the first school of thought. The first one is drawing upon somebody that many of you may well be familiar with, Friedrich Hayek. I used to just introduce Friedrich Hayek by saying the Nobel Prize winner, but that was when the Nobel Prize meant something. So he wrote a famous essay called The Intellectuals and Socialism. And for him, the world gets changes through the power of ideas. And he begins by defining intellectuals, where he uses the term, quote, the second-hand dealers in ideas, unquote, and he gives a list of examples: professors, journalists, authors, teachers, church ministers, artists, and that really useful word, etc. So you might want to think, are there other things you would add to that list of intellectuals? Now he makes a very sharp distinction between what he calls scholars, on the one side, people who come up with original ideas, and I suspect he was thinking of himself when he gave that example, and intellectuals, where he uses a somewhat dismissive term, I think second-hand dealers in ideas, for the people who take these original ideas and then spread them to a wider range of audience. So as a first thing you might want to think about is, what are intellectuals? Are there other peoples that you would add to the list? Second thing, and so this is perhaps one of the classical liberal thing that comes in, is that he thought that intellectuals tended to be socialist or statist in thinking. And his explanation is something, I'm giving a rather crude version of it, but something like this. First of all, that intellectuals, when they look at the world, they see it as full of bad things. They see poverty, they see discrimination. Secondly, intellectuals assume that we know how to create a world where all these bad things are ended. We can do away with poverty, we can do away with discrimination. And thirdly, if only we the intellectuals, had the power and the resources to change the world, we could abolish these bad things. And that's why, any of you who are conservatives here, that whenever somebody, one of your liberal friends says, well, we ought to have a policy of this or a program for that, and you say, no, we shouldn't, their assumption is the only reason you could propose this program is you're a selfish bastard who doesn't care about anybody else. Because obviously, if we knew how to abolish poverty, you'd be in favour of it. If you're not in favour of the latest anti-poverty program, the only reason could be that you don't really care about poverty. So Hayek is very sympathetic to the first claim, that there's lots of bad things in the world. But he's deeply sceptical about the second claim, that we know how to solve these problems. In fact, it's probably best well known, what he got the Nobel Prize for, was the so-called knowledge problem. That no group, no institution, no state has the knowledge to solve problems. Rather, he says, problem is very widely dispersed within society. All of us have knowledge that we build on, and what we need is a society where everybody can use the knowledge that they have, but it's not possible to centralise knowledge to some problem solver. And because of that, because he doubts that we do have the knowledge, is why he opposes giving intellectuals and government too much excessive power. So the second question you might want to think about, do you think it's true that intellectuals tend to be statist? And if you think that's true, why do you think intellectuals tend to be statist? Third claim he makes is that he believes that intellectuals have enormous power. To quote, "It is no exaggeration to say that once the most active part of the intellectuals have been converted to a set of beliefs, the process by which these become accepted is almost automatic and irresistible," close of quote, because they form the opinions of ordinary people. So we have a very clear chain of causation about what changes policy. You start with the scholars then influence the intellectuals then influence the public, and the public determine what the policymakers do. So he has this sort of clear chain. So if this is true, if that is correct, then clearly scholars and intellectuals in the long term determine public policy. That makes them the most important thing because of their influence on the public. So that's the third claim, that intellectuals have enormous power. Is he right? Or is it that intellectuals like me like to think that we have all this power? Are we kidding ourselves to believe that? The fourth claim. He thought it was possible to convince intellectuals of the errors of their ways through reason and argument. He thought that, generally speaking, people agreed on the ends, what we want to achieve. What they disagree with, very often, is empirical questions, facts about what is the most effective way of solving problems. Again, to quote, "It is neither selfish interest nor evil intentions, but mostly honest convictions and good intentions which determine the intellectual views. So he believed that you should assume when you're disagreeing with somebody that the person is well-intentioned, but we think they're wrong. And I have to say, I think that's something that America could learn something about, is treating other people, assuming that the other person has well-intentions, particularly in a current election race. So he thought that the way forward was to present good arguments to change the minds of the intellectuals. That's why everything he wrote was not aimed at reaching the masses, but aimed at reaching a relatively small audience. In fact, he was shocked when one of his books, The Road to Serfdom, became a national bestseller. It was, the abridged version was printed in the Reader's Digest. There's even a cartoon version of The Road to Serfdom. And then recently, when Glenn Beck mentioned it on his show, it went into the Amazon top 10 non-fiction bestsellers. So he was in shock because he thought it would be read by a relatively small number of people. So most of his work was very much directed at reaching the intellectuals. So I'll give an example. He thought one of the reasons why intellectuals were hostile to capitalism is that they misunderstood the impact of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism. That many intellectuals, and because of that most of the public, thought the Industrial Revolution was bad for the working class. But Hayek knew that most of the experts on the Industrial Revolution believed that in fact the Industrial Revolution had been good for the working class. Fewer of their babies died, they lived longer lives, they were healthier than they were before. So he said if only we could explain that to them, they might change their mind. So he edited a book called Capitalism and the Historians, where he got these major authors to write chapters explaining why the Industrial Revolution had been good for the working class. He said he never thought that would be a bestseller, and it wasn't, but it was aimed at what he thought was important class. Similarly, Milton Friedman, again somebody that you may be familiar with, another Nobel Prize winner, as I used to say, he argued the same sort of thing. He thought that one of the major reasons why capitalism had a bad name was that the intellectuals, and therefore the public, believed that the Great Depression was caused by a failure of the market, failure of capitalism, and it had been saved by the interventionism of the New Deal under FDR. Friedman believed, and he wrote a really thick book called A Monetary History of the United States with Anna Schwartz, which I think is his most important academic work, where he demonstrated that it was the failures of the Federal Reserve which led to the Great Depression. And it was the New Deal which actually lengthened and deepened the Great Depression. So he thought if only we could convince intellectuals of what he thought was a correct interpretation of that period, that would have a big difference in terms of their attitudes to capitalism. And of course you saw that with the latest financial crisis. It was the older interpretation that dominated the narrative when there was the financial crisis, that it was a failure of capitalism and interventionism would resolve it. So in that sense he failed to convince the intellectuals, at least most intellectuals, of his position. So this is the view, so Friedman is very similar to Hayek about the causation of what occurs. It's the scholars, intellectuals, the policymakers. And he thought these changes tended to be rather gradual, they were global, and there was a time gap before it had any impact on policy. But again, he thought that intellectuals were really important in determining policy. And he divided the modern era into three: the Adam Smith era,